In a laboratory in Baltimore, a scientist places a small vial under a microscope. Inside are cells, human cells, that have been growing and dividing for over 70 years. They've traveled to space, been infected with countless viruses, helped to develop the polio vaccine. They've been bought and sold billions of times over. They may be the most important cells in medical history, but the woman they came from never knew they were taken. Her name was Henrietta Lacks, and she died in 1951 at the age of 31. This is the story of how one woman's cells became immortal, how they changed medicine forever, and how her family spent decades fighting for recognition in a world that had forgotten her name while profiting from her body. Henrietta Lacks was born Loretta Pleasant in 1920 in Roanoke, Virginia, during a time when the South was still segregated and opportunities for Black Americans were brutally limited. She grew up poor, working tobacco fields alongside her cousins. At 14, she gave birth to her first child. At 20, she married her cousin David Lacks and moved to Baltimore, seeking work in the steel mills and shipyards. They had 5 children together. By all accounts, Henrietta was vibrant, strong, loved to dance, painted her toenails red, and held her family together. In January 1951, she felt a knot in her abdomen. She went to Johns Hopkins Hospital, one of the few hospitals that treated Black patients at the time, and was told she had cervical cancer. The tumor was malignant, aggressive, and growing fast. Doctors treated her with radium tubes, the standard treatment of the era, but the cancer had already spread. 8 months later, Henrietta Lacks was dead, but before she died, something extraordinary happened. During one of her treatments, a surgeon named George Gay took a sample of her tumor without her knowledge or consent. This was standard practice in 1951. Patients, especially poor patients, especially Black patients, had no legal right to control what happened to their tissue. Gay was trying to solve one of medicine's greatest mysteries: why human cells died so quickly in the lab. For decades, scientists had tried to grow human cells outside the body for research, but the cells would divide a few times and then die. Gay had tried thousands of samples. None had survived. Then he put Henrietta's cells in a petri dish. Within 24 hours, they had doubled, and they kept doubling. Every 24 hours, they doubled again. Gad had never seen anything like it. He called them HeLa cells, the first 2 letters of her first and last name. He had just created the first immortal human cell line. Gauthi was not a businessman. He was a researcher, and he gave HeLa cells away freely to any scientist who asked. Within a year, HeLa cells were being shipped around the world. Laboratories in New York, London, Moscow, Tokyo, all growing the same cells, descended from the same woman. By the mid-1950s, HeLa cells were being used to test the polio vaccine, one of the most urgent medical projects of the era. Jonas Salk needed a way to grow massive quantities of polio virus. HeLa cells were the answer. They could be infected with the virus, grown in industrial quantities, and used to test whether the vaccine worked. In 1955, the Salk vaccine was declared safe and effective. Polio, which had paralyzed thousands of children every year, was on its way to eradication. HeLa cells had helped save countless lives, but Henrietta's family had no idea. As the decades passed, HeLa cells became the foundation of modern cell biology. Scientists use them to study how cells divide, how cancer spreads, how viruses infect, how drugs work. They were used in research that led to the development of in vitro fertilization, cloning, gene mapping, and chemotherapy. They were sent on the second-ever space mission to see how cells behaved in zero gravity. They were infected with HIV, tuberculosis, and countless other diseases. Companies began selling HeLa cells commercially. You could order a vial for a few $100s, and it would arrive in the mail ready to grow. An entire industry was built on these cells. Billions of dollars changed hands. Thousands of patents were filed. And through it all, the Lacks family lived in poverty, unable to afford health insurance, unaware that Henrietta's cells were still alive, still being used, still making other people rich. It wasn't until 1973, 22 years after Henrietta's death, that her family learned the truth. A scientist contacted them, asking for blood samples to study the genetics of HeLa cells. Henrietta's husband, Day, was confused. Her children were shocked. "You mean our mother is still alive?" one of them asked. The scientist tried to explain, not her, but her cells. They didn't understand. How could cells be alive without the person? Why hadn't anyone told them? Why hadn't anyone asked permission? The answers were uncomfortable. In 1951, consent wasn't required. Tissue taken during medical procedures was considered abandoned property. And even in 1973, there were no laws protecting patients' rights to their own cells. The Lacks family had no legal claim to HeLa cells, no right to control how they were used, and no share in the profits. Legally, Henrietta's cells belonged to everyone and no one. Ethically, the situation was far more complicated. Henrietta's daughter, Deborah Lacks, became obsessed with understanding what had happened to her mother. She tracked down scientists, visited laboratories, and tried to see the cells for herself. What she found was bewildering. Her mother's cells had been to space. They'd been in nuclear tests. They'd been used in experiments she couldn't begin to understand. And everywhere she went, people knew the name HeLa, but almost no one knew the name Henrietta Lacks. In scientific papers, she was referred to as Helen Lane, Helen Larson, or simply HeLa, anonymized code, a product, not a person. Deborah wanted the world to know her mother's real name. She wanted her mother's contribution to be recognized. But more than that, she wanted to understand who was her mother, really. What had the cancer done to her? And were her mother's cells suffering in all those laboratories around the world? It was a question scientists found strange. But for Deborah, it was deeply personal. If the cells were alive, was some part of her mother still alive too? The ethical questions surrounding HeLa cells only grew more complicated as science advanced. In the 1980s and 90s, researchers began mapping the HeLa genome, the complete genetic code of the cells. This meant that Henrietta's most private biological information shared by her children and grandchildren, was being published openly. Anyone could access it, anyone could study it. The Lacks family was never consulted. They learned about it from the news. This sparked outrage, not just from the family, but from bioethicists, civil rights advocates, and the public. How could this be legal? How could a woman's genetic information be made public without her family's consent? The answer, once again, was that the law hadn't caught up with science. Consent laws, privacy protections, and patients' rights were all developed after HeLa cells had already been distributed worldwide. Henrietta Lacks had fallen through the cracks of history, and her family was left to fight for recognition in a system that hadn't been designed to protect people like them. In 2010, a science writer named Rebecca Skloot published a book called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. It told Henrietta's story, her family's story, and the story of the cells that had changed medicine. The book became an international bestseller, translated into dozens of languages, adapted into a movie. Suddenly, the world knew Henrietta's name. Scientists who had used HeLa cells for decades learned for the first time about the woman behind them. Medical schools began teaching her story as a case study in ethics, and the Lacks family, after 60 years of obscurity, finally received recognition. But recognition wasn't compensation. The family still lived modestly, still struggled with medical bills, while companies continued to profit from HeLa cells. The question remained, did the family deserve financial compensation? And if so, from whom? The scientists who first distributed the cells for free? The companies that later commercialized them? The hospitals and universities that benefited from the research? In 2013, the National Institutes of Health reached an agreement with the Lacks family. It wasn't financial compensation, but it was something a seat at the table. 2 members of the Lacks family would serve on a committee that reviews requests to access HeLa genetic data. Researchers would have to acknowledge Henrietta Lacks in their publications. It was a symbolic victory, a recognition that the family had a say in how Henrietta's legacy was used. But it also highlighted how inadequate our systems are for addressing these issues. What about the thousands of other patients whose tissues have been used in research without consent? What about the people whose genetic data is being collected right now by consumer DNA companies? Henrietta's story is not just history. It's a warning about the present and the future. As biotechnology advances, the questions she raises only become more urgent. Who owns your body? Who owns your cells? Who owns your genetic information? Today, HeLa cells are still everywhere. If you've ever been in a biology classroom, you've probably seen them under a microscope. If you've ever benefited from modern medicine, vaccines, cancer treatments, antiviral drugs, you've benefited from research done with HeLa cells. During the COVID-19 pandemic, HeLa cells were used to study how the virus infected human cells and to test potential treatments. Henrietta Lacks, who died 70 years ago, contributed to saving lives during a global pandemic. Her cells have been cited in over 110,000 scientific publications. They've been involved in research that has won multiple Nobel Prizes. If you weighed all the HeLa cells that have ever been grown, they would total more than 50 million metric tons, heavier than 100 Empire State Buildings. One woman's cells have become a global resource, a scientific commons, a foundation of modern biology. And yet, For most of that time, she was invisible. Henrietta's family has mixed feelings about her legacy. They're proud that she contributed to science, that she saved lives, that her name is now known. But they're also angry about the injustice, the exploitation, the decades of silence. Henrietta's granddaughter, Jerry Lax, put it this way: "She's in every lab in the world, and we can't afford to go to the doctor." That tension between scientific progress and human dignity, between collective benefit and individual rights, is at the heart of Henrietta's story. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Is it enough to say that the research helped humanity? If it was done without consent and without compensation, can we celebrate scientific achievement while also acknowledging the exploitation that made it possible? And how do we move forward in a way that honors both the science and the people behind it? There's a small plaque now at Johns Hopkins Hospital, honoring Henrietta Lacks. Medical students pause in front of it, learning her story before they begin their careers. Her name appears in textbooks, in documentaries, in lectures around the world. But perhaps the most fitting tribute is this: scientists are now working to develop ethical guidelines for tissue research, consent protocols that respect patients' autonomy, and benefit-sharing models that ensure families are included when their loved ones contribute to science. These changes are happening because of Henrietta, because her family refused to let her be forgotten, because people like Rebecca Skloot told her story. The cells are immortal, but so now is the woman. Henrietta Lacks is no longer just Hilla. She's a name, a face, a person, a mother. She's a reminder that behind every scientific breakthrough are human lives, human stories, human dignity. And she's proof that even when the world tries to erase you, the truth has a way of surviving. In a laboratory somewhere right now, a scientist is thawing a vial of HeLa cells. They'll grow under the warm lights, dividing and multiplying, just as they've done for over 70 years. The scientist may pause for a moment, thinking about the woman these cells came from. Henrietta Lacks, who loved to dance, who painted her toenails red, who raised 5 children and died too young. Her cells have outlived her by decades. They've traveled farther than she ever could. They've touched more lives than she ever knew. She never consented, never knew, never benefited, but her contribution is undeniable. The question is not whether science should use human tissue for research. It should, and it must. The question is whether we can do it in a way that respects the humanity of the people we take it from. Henrietta Lacks taught us that lesson. The question is, have we learned it?